Food is Not a Human Right, Issues in Food Democracy with Lana Chehabeddine. She is Behavior Research Lead from Ruminate, a nonprofit innovation lab focused on leveraging behavioral science to inspire social change within the food system. She has researched the relationship between the nationwide empathy deficit and the tolerance for structural injustice within the US food system. She is a Lebanese American, a plant-based home cook and artist who aspires to tackle and shed light on the large systemic issues to help build a more equitable and empathetic society. Our second presenter, Rocio Valendia, is with International Native Tradition Interchange, Food Sovereignty and Indigenous Peoples Traditional Knowledge is the presentation. And Rocio is the INTI has been in existence since 1995, awarded consultative status with the United Nations Economic Social Council in 2004, and works for the advancement of the rights of Indigenous peoples to protect Mother Earth. The organization strives to enhance Indigenous capacity and participation based on traditional knowledge and a holistic vision of the world in cooperation with the international community. And additionally, Rocio was the policy advisor for Indigenous peoples for the 2020 GAMS for New York 27 Green Congressional Campaign. Our third speaker today is Omowale Adewale, an organizer with over 20 years of theoretical and practical application in enhancing egalitarian concepts and systems. He is the founder of Black VegFest and co-founder of Grassroots Artists Movement, GAME. He is a two-time kickboxing champion and boxing champion of New York, and the author of an introduction to veganism and agricultural globalism. The book explores Western imperialism's supernatural neocolonialism's approach to using GMOs as weaponized food through big agra. And this year, Omowale serves as the editor of Brother Vegan, which discusses the struggles, triumphs, and nuances of Black vegan men. The next presentation will be three presenters from the Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace Steering Committee of the Native American Studies Department at Humboldt State University. Evie Ferreira is a passionate about intergenerational efforts to steward the land, restore traditional plants and native lands, and revitalize native foodways. Through participation in Native American studies, Indigenous natural resource management practices, she has helped organize the Food Sovereignty Lab. And she is a Portuguese Mexican American, and I'm going to mispronounce this. Please accept my apologies and correct me during our speak, but it's Yomi. We also have Carrie, Tully, graduate student, and in the Environment and Community Program at Humboldt State University, who also works for Save California Salmon and the Northeast Environmental Center. She has been motivated by her own complex life experiences and strives to address, understand, and seek ways to heal traumas by building relationships with the community, the passion that drove her to work with Food Sovereignty Lab project. So she understands the fundamental need for communities to build these bridges. And the third presenter of that presentation is Cody Henrickson, and he is of the, please correct me, Ninchik Village Tribe of Alaska. Cody is an undergraduate at Humboldt State University studying marine biology and Native American studies, hopes to use his education to preserve, promote, and revive his people's unique culture and traditional knowledge systems. Next, we have Lupita Vazquez Reyes. She is a former Florida Farmworker organizer and now a community garden advocate and outreach assistant for Cultivate Abundance. In the past, she has used a culturally appropriate and relevant gardening in response to food insecurity for the Florida farm worker population, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in the hometown of Immokalee. She focuses on the cultural and ancestral knowledge of the community, uplifting immigrant identities and bringing awareness to the social and environmental injustices that impact them disproportionately. And our last speaker today will be Chef Shelli McInnis, coming to you from where I'm at. She's an owner pastry chef of the Sweet Spot and Urban Lounge, mother of 2, blended mom of 3, born in Detroit. And she has had over decades in social services, but now operates not only the bakery, cafe, dessert lounge with her husband, but grows her own food, processes that food, sews, crochets, bakes, and she teaches wonderful canning, which I have been on those Zooms and appreciate that so much, and her spirit in doing so. So welcome to all of our speakers, and we will be transitioning now to our first speaker, Lana.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just going to be sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Lana Chehabeddine, and I am thrilled to be presenting on the topic of food is not a human right, issues in food democracy. This topic stems from my master's thesis research, which aimed at analyzing structural injustice in the food system and its relationship to empathy. Specifically, I will be discussing food democracy as a prerequisite to food sovereignty in today's presentation. But I became fascinated by these topics through a journey of realizations. I was first introduced to food systems when I pursued my studies in nutrition because I love the idea of preventing health issues before they became real issues. After furthering my studies, however, I discovered that the reductivist and individualized vision of nutrition did not address the root causes that drive most of our food-related problems today. So I'll be unpacking some of the main topics of this presentation, pulling from my research findings, and discussing what steps could be taken to bring us closer to having food acknowledged as a human right in the US. When we think about this idea of food as a human right, it becomes clear that in the United States of America, food is not viewed as a right, but other natural components of survival generally are, such as air and water. Now, there's a societal understanding that our homes come equipped with access to water and that the air we breathe should be generally clean for human respiration, yet the US does not embrace this idea when it comes to food, which is realized when every individual or community has physical and economic access at all times to healthy, sustainable, and culturally appropriate food or means for its procurement. In other words, it's about ensuring that humans have the capacity to feed themselves in dignity. In reality, the US Constitution does not contain provisions related to the right to adequate food. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the US signed the Right to Food Agreement in 1977, which stemmed from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but has not yet become a state party. The first of 8 guidelines to adopt the right to food model is one that highlights democracy, good governance, human rights, and the rule of law. This brings me to the next part of the conversation, which is to reassess and review the idea of democracy. In order to highlight the pathway for adopting a right to food in the US, we must do 2 things. 1 is identify and address the gaps in our democracy, and 2, understand and make steps towards food democracy, which is the prerequisite to the right to food. Now, democracy is generally understood as a system of governance in which laws are directly or indirectly decided by the people. In my research, I found that the rhetoric and action surrounding the concept of democracy are empathy-provoking because it enables the people to debate major topics of concern through open deliberation. As a result, democracy elicits participant mobilization and an effort to build a more just society. Food democracy, in comparison, aims at boosting this participation among citizens by shying away from the powerful corporate food monopoly and going beyond the idea of food security, which focuses on the what, which is healthy access to food for all. Food democracy, on the other hand, delves more into the how, which can include designing spaces for discussion and implementing food policies. Achieving food democracy brings us closer to another concept called food sovereignty, which is the only concept and movement, in my opinion, that fully embraces the people's right to food and the right to define our own food and agricultural systems. So you must be thinking, well, how do we get there, and what's stopping us from adopting the right to food? As a country, we have gravitated away from true democracy, and part of this has been due to the dominance of other national ideologies that have effectively suppressed our ability to empathize. On the one hand, democracy elicits compassion, diversity, and situational awareness, in which we consider who or what might be affected by our decisions. On the other hand, we have three isms that do the quite opposite. This triad of capitalism, neoliberalism, and individualism are intertwined and repress empathy by exploiting human labor and resources to boost our economy, deepening the wealth gap through a skewed free market system, prioritizing profit over people, and embracing an us versus them mentality that deepens ignorance and acts of othering. These ideologies are not only highlighted in our food system, but have been the foundation for which it has thrived. Now, our food system is far from democratic and quite far from adopting a right to food model. It exploits people for labor, animals for food, and the environment for food production. It is important to highlight its history as one that was built on the backs of displaced immigrants and in favor of white men who owned and controlled most land across the US and still do today. The first three examples of food system influencers you see here are all under the guise of capitalism, which, as the prevailing US economic system, has reaped financial success for the nation, but at the expense of others, such as the food system's overworked and underpaid workforce. Our capitalist food system creates an illusion of free choice. Lobbying groups pay large lump sums to influence food policies and social structures. Large corporations are getting larger by monopolizing the food economy and concentrating most profits into just a few companies' hands. Big farms, sometimes referred to as big ag, are often run by these large corporations and help determine what we buy from the grocery store by growing the commodity crops that are utilized in the majority of our food products, such as corn and soy. They also influence the Farm Bill and farm subsidies, as most of you probably already know. And lastly, our social constructs are essentially man-made labels, such as race, class, and gender, that determine our food choice because our identities hold an inherent discrimination inflicted on us by our society. This category is one in which I will touch on further towards the end of this presentation.
Lana, is it possible that you could only show one slide at once? Right now, you have all your slides up on the screen.
Oh, yes. Let me see how I can do that. Are you seeing every single one at the same time?
Yes, at the bottom, and you have the next slide up.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
That's better. Thank you.
No problem. So in 2006, President Barack Obama made a statement at Northwestern University, and it still rings true today. Quote, "There's a lot of talk in this country about the federal deficit, but I think we should talk more about our empathy deficit, the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to see the world through those who are different from us, the child who's hungry, the laid off steelworker, the immigrant woman cleaning your dorm room. As you go on in life, cultivating this quality of empathy will become harder, not easier. You'll be free to live in neighborhoods with people who are exactly like yourself and send your kids to the same schools and narrow your concerns to what's going on in your own little circle. Not only that, we live in a culture that discourages empathy." End quote. So what I've come to realize in my research is that there is a national empathy deficit. Empathy is an ability that most humans are born with. It's an innate ability, but it also can be learned and something that we practice and become better at. Empathy can be understood as understanding someone else's perspective and using that perspective to better one's situation. So it goes beyond just being in someone else's shoes. Now, why is that important? Well, it helps us with social transformation, with social change, and it makes us care for others. Now, the issue is that in the US, there is a decline in empathy. One major study done by the University of Michigan showed that we have a 40% decline in empathy amongst college graduates. So this is something that we definitely are lacking and has been affecting our social structures and political climate. Now, empathy is comprised of three aspects. The first aspect is affective empathy. The second aspect is cognitive empathy, and the third is empathic response. Affective empathy is basically mimicry. So when we see someone else's yawn, we catch their yawn, or we see someone else crying, we start to tear up. In cognitive empathy, we do perspective taking, and in empathic response, that's when we become moved to actually make a difference and change someone else's situation after putting ourselves in their shoes. So we, in the country, the US today, we are facing something that we can call now a food apartheid. Most people use the term food desert, but food desert does not encapsulate the entire picture and the root causes of most of the food system problems that we face today. So we have structural and systemic injustice in the US food system that creates intentional gaps where marginalized communities of color are prevented from accessing healthy food. This is a result of the redlining and urban planning of our social structures of society, and that has prevented certain groups of people based on race, class, and gender, and other social constructs to get access to healthy food. And one of the phrases that has been thrown around in addition to food apartheid is white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, which we can find being one of the biggest things that can define our food system, since we have most farmers are white farmers, we have most of the food growers being male, and so on and so forth. So it is important to note that it is more than just a food desert that we are facing across the country. It is actually a food apartheid. Now, in looking at how we can create a robust food democracy, we can start by trying to level the playing field between the corporate food players and the citizens that want to participate in the food system. And the way that we can do that is by starting to integrate more food policy councils at a local level and at the bigger federal level to create potentially a US Food Democracy Council in which we can vote for the representatives that can help either grow new policy councils or help sustain ones that are already going on. And we can continue to do this by advocating further through grassroots movements and trying to really push for more policymaking and implementing those, and not just having them written down, actually making them real and something that we can find in society. So the first thing that I found in my research as far as policy solutions to activate empathy is in education. So we can try to incorporate policies that incorporate the history of our food system into school curriculum, into classes such as history and psychology that assess trauma, and make it more about learning about the history of our food system, and not just why food is important and nutrition and those kinds of classes, but actually making it something that young youth can understand and try to work towards fixing, because they will be the future of our food system. And this can be incorporated into our farm to school initiatives. And like I said, other cooking classes, history classes, psychology, and so forth. The second part is technology. We can find that federal policies will help fund academic research and projects focus on tech-driven solutions to address the US food apartheid. There are many different types of technologies that are used in the food system today, but putting money towards research and finding what technologies work best to actually address these larger issues is what I find to be more important. And incorporating this into university research grants and even geographic information systems mapping projects can help certain organizations address the gaps and kind of make technology and food help address some of the issues that we're facing through policy. And now the third thing that I found was narratives and storytelling, and incorporating that into policy, because narratives are how we develop our belief systems and develop an understanding of others. So having state and citywide policies to support public institutions and hold spaces to share these kinds of stories surrounding food will be really important to create a narrative for what our food system has been built on and what it can be, what it can look like in the future. And a couple of examples of this are having a Mile in My Shoes library section, where you take an audio tape and listen to someone's experience that either works in the food system or has been affected by it. And a human library event where you check out a person instead of a book and speak one-on-one to someone to learn about them and activate empathy that way. So that is the end of my presentation, and I thank you all so very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lana. Can you also hit stop screen sharing? And now I got to hit a couple buttons. But up next is food is not a human right. I'm sorry, that's what we just did. Is food sovereignty and indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge. And we're joined by Rocio Valendia, who is with the International Native Traditional It's a Change. And you unmute. Rocio, you should be able to start speaking. And if you need a screen share, you should have the ability to do that.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you.
See me, right? That's what I'm working on. Just 1 second. Let me see. There we go.
Great. Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Tomorrow, the United Nations is celebrating World Food Safety Day with the theme, food safety is everyone's business. And it is with emphasis on the public sector, the private sector, universities, schools, and nursing homes. So I'm going to base my presentation on 3 issues: food and racial issues, food and health issues, food and poverty issues. Relating to food and racial issues, we have seen that many communities of colors and ethnically diverse are affected by the fact that there is no access in the neighborhoods to healthy foods. Here in New York, I'll give you the example of Whole Foods. I'm not sure it's a very good example, but I'm just saying Whole Foods cannot be found in neighborhoods other than white neighborhoods. When you look at ethnic diverse neighborhoods, you find your corner bodegas, which for the most part are unhealthy foods, junk foods. You have McDonald's, Burger King, very difficult to access a health bar or a place where you can buy healthy food. So access to healthy food in ethnic communities is of difficulty. The other issue that we saw is, for example, in the case of a health food, which is quinoa, which is a traditional food from the Andes in South America. We see that it is very expensive and it is considered, of course, a health food. The people that sell it for the most are white people. The people that produce it are indigenous people, and all the profits go to the white people and the indigenous communities that produce it in the Andes do not see, do not share on the profits. On the issue of food and health, we see how through the scientific community, foods were manipulated, and we see foods that contain cancer-producing ingredients, pesticide residue, and even residue of veterinarian drugs in our food supply. So the food chain is poisoned, and it greatly affects all of our healths. On the issue of food poverty, oddly, we see that there is an increase in obesity, in the rise, and this is in every region, because of the consumption of unhealthy and poor quality diets. So poverty is increasing, but so is obesity. I'm sorry on my accent. There's also the fact that so much food is wasted while the majority of the population goes hungry. The world's efforts are not on track to achieve zero hunger by 2030, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. As original nations who have practiced good living and who have lived for thousands of years in harmony with nature, producing our own foods, taking care of the water supply, and protecting the planet as a whole, we stress the importance of restoring our relation as humans to Earth. And this is on a daily basis, day-to-day practice, where we plant and do our best to produce our own source of food. This is something simple. For example, in the cities, all you need is pottery, some soil, and a window, and you will be able to see that you can grow much of the produce that you need. Regaining that connection to Mother Earth is basic to our survival. Our vision as indigenous peoples is always to protect, and the opposite can be said of the private sector or science and technology, where their primary interest is to use, exploit, and profit from the resources. As indigenous peoples and also as guardians of our traditional knowledge, the complexity of the ownership and the manipulation of seeds, for example, by institutions such as the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, is something that is very concerning to us in the food security path. On the 4th of June, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystems Restoration was launched to include the forests of the world, but also life below water and the blue economy, as humanity more and more looks into fishing and fish products to balance the diet. We also have to keep in consideration the contamination of the oceans because of plastic and chemicals, and how this is affecting our food chain also. We look into the value of a fish the same way as we look into the value of a tree. A tree is more valuable alive for indigenous people, where to the World Timber Organization, it is more valuable dead. A dead tree is worth money. And the same is the situation with fish and marine life. Ultimately, the role and the recognition for indigenous peoples at an international level and what we can contribute to this challenge that we are facing needs to be taken into consideration, and is one of the reasons why International Native Tradition Interchange has been asking for an indigenous ambassador within the United Nations system. We believe that only through the incorporation of indigenous people's traditional knowledge will the world be able to come up with solutions that are not only greenwashing, but that are more of rescuing the core of our humanity, the core of our relation to nature. And that is something that has been kept, possessed, and transmitted from generation to generation by indigenous peoples. We have also shared the international stage with the scientific community, with business, and science, technology, business, and industry. And we don't see them as allies, but more as competitors. Science wanting to study and manipulate traditional knowledge, as is the case of the seeds, as I mentioned before. We see the situation with the food and the water of the world as a destruction of the natural laws caused in many instances by transnationals, which seem to float above the law. So instead of concentrating so much on climate change, perhaps we should be concentrating on how to control and have these transnationals brought to be accountable for all the destruction that they are causing in our food system, in our health system.
1 minute reminder, over.
And to close, I would just like to remind you of the words of Chief Seattle, who said that everything is related, and that I don't believe that the destroyers can also be the saviors. There has to be leadership by indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rocio. We will have time for questions at the end of all the presentations. I know this is a little bit rushed, but we had a lot of great speakers sign up, and we felt all of them were worthwhile to hear. I did not get a pronunciation of this name. Omowale Adewale, who's with Black VegFest, which actually takes place somewhat in my old neighborhood in Bedford-Stuyvesant of Brooklyn. And he's going to be talking about green solutions, Black veganism, and the end of factory farming.
Hello, how you doing? I'm gonna bring my video in here. Well, apparently I can't start my video just yet. Oh, I think I might have solved that issue. Okay, how you doing? How you doing?
Good.
Okay. Give me a second to share my screen. Start. Okay, one sec. So much button pushing. Okay, how you doing, everyone? I have 10 minutes, right? So several slides to go through. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So today I'm discussing green solutions, but also green party solutions.
I'll just quickly mention you have 2 slides that are up. I don't know if you can only get up to have 1 slide on at a time.
Okay.
If not, that's okay. I'm just pointing that out.
Okay. Oh, okay. Very good. Okay. So, and why Black veganism has been popping up more and more in Black communities. And I want to discuss some of those positives and what that looks like when we talk about organizing. Okay, I'll move this out the way. And additionally, and why I think the Green Party needs to add veganism and factory farming to its platform. Okay. All right. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a father of 3, Rain, Aziza, and Chisore. My fiance and organizing buddy is Nadia. My work is Black liberation, but I've been known to do some unionizing collaborations with other peoples of the world, freedom, justice, folks in the movement, food justice collaborations, political organizing, healthcare access activities, author of An Introduction to Veganism, Agricultural Globalism, and this year's Brother Vegan. I do my community organizing through various groups, namely GAME, Grassroots Artist Movement, and then it's Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, and Black VegFest. So, Black veganism is on the rise. Regardless of how obnoxious a lot of vegans are, and some of them are, or can be, it's scientifically, better for our planet, right? And I also believe, for ourselves. Although, we communicate and we have discussions on that back and forth, and we need to. The same way we talk about how to actually make single payer work, or Medicare for all, universal health care, right? But we still work with that platform with those objectives. And when it's Black and it's veganism, it's smart, critical, and creative, and dedicated to the ethics that animals is a planet and always ourselves. So there's vegan intersectionality, which I would love to discuss more about that for questions in case people are unclear or new to that term. But I will be going into some of this. And also, number 2, the farmers using biotech engineering for mass production, land grab techniques in India and throughout the world. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about factory farming. I'm not talking about your farm right outside your home and you're trying to feed your family or 10 or 20 people in your community and grow. I'm talking about the farms with tens of thousands of acres and with factories killing millions and billions, rather, animals a year. So Black people are 30% more likely to die from heart disease. So this is when I started to really think veganism a lot more. when I understood this. And I understood this in a very personal way because I went vegetarian when I was 15. I was diagnosed with hypertension. Many of you know that's not something that, it's not an age where you can be diagnosed normally with hypertension, but it happens, right? And some of you might have known that about others, or you might be those same folks. Eventually, I decided to be vegan, go vegan, because 20 years of, not feeling weak because I did not consume meat. And I was, listen, I didn't need to consume animal flesh to grow muscles, including heavy lifting, running, and being all around active. So, and I definitely want to talk about a little bit about how health-wise veganism is a helpful answer to a lot of folks. I'll say that at least beginning, right? So I do this presentation, some different places, around this, this locally, this city, this state, this country, and also around the world. And 95%, I'll just bring out some of the pieces. And we're talking about, the beef patty that goes on your bread for a sandwich. We're talking about burgers, and we're talking about, veggie burgers. So if people have ever looked at like how much cholesterol, how much fat they're consuming is right here on this piece, right? 95% fat, 83% cholesterol. And what you're not seeing is 122% saturated fat. This is just 1 pound of raw meat that's cooked down. Usually it's going to be cooked down, so it's going to be 3/4. It's going to yield about 3/4 of that meat or a little less, right? So just imagine and think about those bacon, egg, and cheese and how big those might be sometimes with burgers, at any of your fast food restaurants, right? So I have to think about that from my community standpoint. Like, what is actually killing us? What are some of the things that we can actually address? So I compare that to the bean patty, which has 18 grams of protein and iron is 37%. So we're talking about also a cup. If you can read that, the serving size here is being compared to lentils in a cup. So that is 1 cup, that's 18 grams of protein, and the iron being 30%, 37%. That's the recommended daily allowance. For each of these percentages of the recommended daily allowance, okay, by the USDA. Okay. So 8% of Black Americans are strict vegans or vegetarians compared to just 3% of the general population. This actually happened not too long. It's an article in the BBC that named me Black VegFest. Laurie Kim Alexander also Black VegFest, and a bunch of other African folks, Black people around this country and throughout the world in terms of the change and the transition and where that's actually coming from, right? Because we're doing that work. We're part of doing that work. And my objective first, when we were looking to found Black VegFest, was always Black liberation. And I had to be very clear from the very beginning, because it's very difficult often to get events done, because Black people don't recognize Black as being cultural the same way they see, Chinese, or the same way they see, Jewish, but it's also, that's our culture. And every single thing that we have, and you've heard this before, we can't have shit to ourselves. And that is problematic. So we have to create those. And then when you go through the process of doing it by yourself, because then folks are like, do it yourself. And we'll do it ourselves, right? But then there'll be all these different road traps and all these obstacles that actually make it happen. The hardest part of doing Black VegFest starting in 2018 was the city. And we already was working with Brooklyn Borough President at that time. And so just the city makes it really difficult for you to do these particular events, especially when you're talking about, liberation. And within this particular, with the photos that you're seeing, people understood that was understood through the images that we put out there, that we wanted to have, we wanted to center Black women. We also wanted to center Black trans. We wanted to center folks who are doing so much work in our community to help grow and transform it. And they don't really get the props that they deserve. And so, and they come out and they do it consistently and readily. So, we really try to make our events, comfortable and affordable. So they're free, and with most of the spaces, even our main performances, are free events. And then we want to move forward. That's Richard Rogers. So this was he was coming down to Black VegFest 2019 of Philly VegFest, and to show solidarity. Man, that's the kind of the work that we want to highlight, we want to spotlight, and we support those folks that do that. This is our Black men's panel on masculinity. So as you see, we have a room full of mostly Black and BIPOC women in that space, in that room, listening and to hear. So we want to make sure that what we say is everything that is fruitful for liberation. I want to move forward a little quicker, so I get stuck on these. So we feed people. And I think that's important. And like I said, our work is Black women, centered, because by and large, that's who shows up and gets us our victories. That becomes science, for us. And pretty much those are the folks who basically show up. So I want to be quick so I can also talk about, a little bit what we don't really speak about, so much, is this intersectionality, this vegan intersectionality of different oppressions, the overlapping of our of the different oppressions that we have, the different obstacles that we see on a consistent basis, the different things that we lift up. When we are fighting against something, by and large, Black community is going through it, like we go through it and have to address it, otherwise, we die. It's not an issue that we can say that, I don't know if we can do this. It's why we are tired. It's why we're fatigued. It's also, but we see also, oppressed peoples. We see, oppressed animals, out there as well. So, last year, actually 2 years ago, I testified at City Hall to support the ban on foie gras. So this is basically, duck and geese liver. We have our own liver, right? And that's actually where we make our cholesterol. That's the cholesterol, in our system. And so we also don't need foie gras or duck liver, because it's just expensive. It's cholesterol heavy, right? So,
1 minute reminder, over.
Thank you. And unnecessary and unsustainable. So I'm gonna flip through some of these. And also the fur ban, is also something that, we support. It's also unnecessary. And when I bring up intersectionality, it's important to understand Kimberly Crenshaw is the person who coined that term for what Black women were going through or are going through. So 9 billion animals are raised every single year, and they're murdered, they're killed, and it is having disastrous effect on our planet. Factory farm animals produce more than 1 million tons of manure a day. 80% of the agricultural land is raising livestock, or the food that we feed livestock. Ridiculous. So when we talk about AFO's concentrated animal feeding operations, we are understanding that the 14.5% that they say the gas is emitting, the methane gas, but we can also talk about the CO2 gas as well that's coming from the transportation, the fertilization, the pesticides, all the engines that have to be running daily, all the tractor trailers that are going through that are crossing this land every single day with billions and billions of animals. So that 14.5 is really focusing on the 44% methane gas that cows are emitting through the gas through their gas on while they're grazing.
Thank you, Omowale. We're going to have to go to the next speaker, but could you please put contact information so that everyone can follow more of what you're talking about? And again, I think your name was mispronounced in the beginning. Could you please?
Omowale Adewale. Thank you very much. And I am hoping that we choose to end factory farming and recommend veganism.
Thank you, Omowale.
Well, thank you very much. And as Lizzie pointed out in the chat, part of this forum relates to building for the 2021 United Nations Food Summit as a follow-up, and we're trying to uplift voices that are not adequately being heard on food sovereignty, food democracy, food justice, and food insecurity. Up next, a triple header. Imagine an indigenized food campus with Cody Henrickson, Carrie, Tully, and Evie Ferreira from the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab.
Thank you so much. We're just going to go ahead and pull up our presentation for you. And we'll be in a screen share mode so you can see all three of us as we're coming together as a group. It's an honor to be here with the other presenters.
I'm ready to go when you all are.
Okay. Tovote hola. Ka jayasawe ketewa. Inupo Evie teake. Hello, my name is Evie Ferreira. Thank you for having us here today. I am Yoeme, Mestiza, Mexican American, and Portuguese, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Cody and Carrie.
Yaghalidu, my name is Cody Henrickson. I am Sugpiak and Denina, and also Norwegian and Danish and Russian. And I'm a proud enrolled member of the Ninilchik village tribe.
And hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carrie Tully. I am a settler here in the United States, but my ancestors are descendants of mixed European and Ashkenazi Jewish nationalities. And together here, we are presenting as the co-founders of the Native American Studies Food Sovereignty Lab and members of the Food Sovereignty Lab Steering Committee.
Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge Humboldt State University's occupation of unceded Wiyot territory. This territory includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. HSU is located in Gardini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of not only the history of this area, but also in continuing knowledge of this place. As numerous Indigenous scholars have articulated, land acknowledgements are a beginning, not an end. For land acknowledgements to be meaningful, they need to be accompanied with action. Today, my call to action for all of you is to donate to the Native American Studies Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. And my co-presenter will put a link in the chat. As members of the steering committee, we wish to introduce the Food Sovereignty Lab project to you.
So next, we'd like to highlight the ways that we interpret food sovereignty. Dr. Katja Risling-Baldi and Dr. Caitlin Reed, co-directors of the Food Sovereignty Lab, stated, "At the heart of food sovereignty is the self-determination of individuals, communities, and groups over their food systems. Food sovereignty includes revitalizing and preserving cultural connections. This fundamentally necessitates restoring tribes with their traditional territories. We must center Indigenous voices as we collectively move forward in building sustainable food systems." Indigenous scholars Devin Mahiswa and Elizabeth Hoover write that the concept of Indigenous food sovereignty is not focused on only rights to land, food, and the ability to control a production system, but also responsibilities to culturally, ecologically, and spiritually appropriate relationships with elements of those systems. Therefore, the revitalization of food sovereignty relies on connecting to traditional food sources in our region.
What does it mean to revitalize cultural relationships with our environment and community? Native American scholar and activist Winona LaDuke states, "Food sovereignty is an affirmation of who we are as Indigenous peoples and one of the most sure-footed ways to restore our relationship with the world around us. We believe that reviving our relationship with food and food sovereignty will enable us to rebuild that relationship. At the Food Sovereignty Lab, this will include uplifting student voices, and as you can see in the slide, so much more."
To fully understand food sovereignty, we must first contemplate the impacts of colonization on the Indigenous nations of this region. Genocide was carried out by severing indigenous peoples from their land, culture, and food systems. In 1887, when the Dawes Act was passed, what was once communally held land began being replaced with white settler-owned homesteads. While settlers forced their own version of agriculture into indigenous spaces, tribal peoples were given government rations, empty treaties, and barren land to live on. These genocidal acts diminished the healthy relationship of indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands. Due to the United States legislation and state policies, there continues to be many negative effects on health, education, and sustainability of diverse indigenous cultures. As a result, universities such as our own have become inherently exclusionary with regard to indigenous knowledge systems. The Food Sovereignty Lab Steering Committee believes that the implementation of this project at HSU will serve to address these issues.
The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace is intrinsically interdisciplinary and a collaborative effort that is student designed and community informed. The project was designed and proposed by students in the fall of 2019 as a part of the Indigenous Natural Resource Management Practices course. These students represented 12 different majors from across campus. We worked collaboratively during the semester to interview Native students, faculty, and staff on campus, and then we held a community stakeholders meeting to discuss the implementation of the lab at HSU. We were subsequently awarded a second place prize in the CSU student-led research competition in April 2020 in the graduate level behavioral and social sciences category.
Despite the hard work of students, the initial request for space on campus to develop the lab was denied under the assumption that an indigenous space would not serve the student body as a whole, effectively blocking the project from moving forward. Assuming indigenous knowledges are too specialized for a general community furthers harmful stereotypes of indigenous peoples and negatively impacts students' education. Students then mobilized to secure over 100 letters of support and organized an appeal to the University Senate, where we were finally granted the space needed to pursue our goal. Student and community advocacy ultimately was successful, as our request for space was approved conditionally, as long as the project was funded entirely without the aid of the school.
We're here to speak to the dreams, goals, and community relationships which surround the Food Sovereignty Lab, where we will strive to elevate and uplift indigenous leadership, knowledge, and self-determination, develop curriculum, internships, research opportunities, workshops, and programs on campus. It will provide space that supports basket weaving, food preparation, and regala making, strengthen the bond between our local community, indigenous nations, and students at HSU today, tomorrow, all the while including the historical legacy of past Native American Studies students. This is to integrate the values of ecological sustainability, biocultural sovereignty of indigenous peoples, and community involvement in efforts to develop reverence for food sovereignty.
As we've been gearing up for the opening of the Food Sovereignty Lab, we have been working on the following projects. During November 2020, we held a food sovereignty speaker series where we had indigenous food sovereignty experts and practitioners speak every week. This spring, we hosted 3 film screenings, Good Meat, Return, and Gather, which all focus on people who strive to reconnect with their ancestral foodways. Lastly, we have been and is currently our fundraising for the Food Sovereignty Lab. We held a month-long crowdfunding event culminating with our fundraiser Zoomathon, where we hosted a myriad of performers and conducted a silent auction to raise money. We raised over $25,000 during that month. Our fundraising goal for the construction of the first 2 years of our work in the Food Sovereignty Lab is $250,000. In the last year alone, we have raised over $200,000.
When envisioning the future of the Food Sovereignty Lab, projects and applications could potentially include partnerships with local and international tribes, expanded courses and programs on campus at HSU, a Native American Studies lab course on food sovereignty, and articulating Native American Studies students will have the opportunity to further develop their own ideas for the lab. Ted Hernandez, chairman of the Wiyot tribe, said that such a lab could provide hands-on experience for students and tribal members in fields such as botany, biology, anthropology, Native American studies, and natural resources management, to name a few. The end result would be an interdisciplinary learning lab worthy of HSU that would both attract Indigenous people and students from out of the area, while also serving the local Indigenous peoples by helping to preserve their food sovereignty and native food security.
So currently we're building Wiyot Plaza, or we will start doing that very soon. Due to our continuous successes with fundraising, our construction date is set for October 8th, 2021. The Food Sovereignty Lab will sit adjacent to the Native American Forum and the Godini Gallery, which is in the Behavioral and Social Sciences building, making a centralized space of Indigenous representation, aptly dubbed Wiyot Plaza. In order to learn more about our project, please visit the HSU Native American Studies Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube pages, as well as the Food Sovereignty Lab website, which we will link in the chat for you. And we've also published multiple articles on the lab, and we will try to get links for those for you guys as well.
So thank you. We realize that we are not the first, nor will it be the last group of people who are working towards the revitalization of Indigenous food sovereignty. We wish to recognize the hard work of those who have uplifted food sovereignty long before us, and those who do so today, including our presenters and our community partners whom you see on this slide right here. Thank you to the Food Sovereignty Committee as well, and my co-presenters.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carrie, Cody, and Evie. We have two more speakers, and we're supposed to be opening it up for questions and answers. But especially in view of the time, if people want to start submitting, as some of you already have done, start submitting questions in the chat room. Maybe some of our speakers can respond on chat before we get to the formal question and answer, which will also be done by chat. Our next segment is on food sovereignty, an immigrant farm organizer's journey. Lupita Vazquez Reyes, who's a Florida farm worker organizer and a community garden outreach assistant.
And I'm going to jump in here. Hi, this is Lizzie. The title was corrected to Cultivating Community Healing and Mindfulness Through Ancestral Plants, a Reclaiming of Food, Storytelling, and Traditional Ecological Knowledge in Immokalee. And we'll take you now, Lupita.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lupita Vazquez Reyes. I am Indígena first and foremost. I am also identify as mestiza, and my lineage is from the Huasteca region of what we know as Mexico, where my ancestors are Otomi and Pame. And I call on those ancestors now and ask for their guidance as I share with you a little bit of my story. I call on my grandmother Sara, Asuncion, Antonio, and all of those very healed and well ancestors, including my father, Candelario Vazquez from the Huasteca region. And I thank everybody for this opportunity to share a part of what goes on here in Immokalee and part of the way that I create space, not only for my own healing, but also for my community. As the intro talked about, and I'm also, Immokalee is part of former territory or original territory of the Calusa, Seminole, and Miccosukee tribes. We live in a community that is filled with immigrant farm workers from all parts of North America and all these First Nation and Native Americas. So it is part of our just existence here in this area of Immokalee, where we are constantly reminded of our indigeneity and our identity as First Nation people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here and a little bit of my journey in regards to food sovereignty and just food justice. So I first became connected to the injustices of farm workers here in Immokalee, first and foremost because my parents were immigrant farm workers who came to Immokalee because of the simple statement of some former people that had been here that said there is work in Immokalee. And so they came and immigrated here and began work in the 70s, very early 70s and 80s, and were soon involved in a lot of the organizing that was happening through some of the organizers like Valdemar Velazquez with the UFW, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, even in the West Coast. And they knew of Immokalee and they knew of the farm workers exploitation that was happening here, and were started organizing early in that time. So I was born in 78 and I was a child, being raised within that context of my parents being farm workers, but also coming into their own organizing and knowledge and consciousness of, the injustices that they were suffering in the fields while picking tomatoes. And so I used to, part of my development obviously is that legacy, right, of advocacy and organizing from my own parents who were farm workers here and growing up as a migrant farm worker family. But also when I was a teenager, part of what we experienced was my father falling ill with cancer. It was around 1993 when a small organization and group of workers were meeting in a church nearby in our town to discuss education and worker rights and identification of safety and other concerns that were happening in the field. And this was later known, what we know now as the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. At that time, my interest was to show up to those meetings because I wanted to know about the connection between pesticide exposure and my father falling ill with cancer at the time. And what I learned there really opened my eyes, because even though I had grown up as a migrant farm worker with my family and had seen them working, I don't know that we had really, and that they had been organizers. I don't know that we had really discussed just root causes, of why they had immigrated here, and just hadn't had the opportunity to really discuss it as from a framework of them organizing themselves and leading this type of education, and circling of workers coming together to really talk about what they were experiencing. And so that was really impactful for me. I remember my father no longer being able to wake up in the mornings and go to work because he was so ill with the cancer and going through treatment. But in those early days, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers started organizing around a worker situation where he hadn't gotten paid and he had actually been brutally beat for asking for his wages. And so it was one of the earliest actions that happened when I was 14, around 1983, 94. And I remember walking just a block over to the area where the workers would get picked up in the morning. And, it was still dark. And there was a huge feeling of being connected to this struggle and to this injustice, and how I could play a part and how I could carry the legacy that my parents had instilled in me forward. And so that really became the catalyst for me continuing on with working with farm worker communities and really being invested in what it is to bring just sovereignty to the work that they're doing and also to the communities, right? Like, how do we come together and have these discussions about what is affecting us and what is, keeping us from being healthy, from having access to food, to healthy food, and just, I guess, becoming a community, right? Because I think the nature of the work in these, huge farm worker industries is that you're just a body and you're expendable. just as my dad got sick, and, like the farm where he was working wasn't going to call and ask about him or how we were doing. And so we saw this disconnect. So, throughout my life, I've been involved with the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, but also in my own community. I had to move away, obviously for college and to raise my family. I lived in Austin, Texas for a long time. And I recently had come back. And one of the things that I've experienced is that we have to really connect community to the work that is being done around food systems, because how do we like join forces with the people that are already, putting food on our nation's table, but yet we don't listen to them. It's not led by them. The discussions they don't have a seat at the table. And that's why the work of the CIW is so powerful and still continues to influence a lot of the work that I do now in the community garden. I currently work as a community garden outreach assistant, building capacity in our own community and in our garden space for community members to come and to have a space where they can connect through traditional food knowledge and, ecological practices and ways to plant. And so a lot of what I do is based on creating that type of space, honoring the relationship that we have with our ancestral plants. And I wanted to share a little bit because most recently, and the picture that you see behind me is this Guatemalan maize corn that was that we planted and within, as the community, and were able to harvest recently. And we had an event at our garden where we were able to come together to prepare it, prepare masa for tortillas and for other just other culturally relevant food use. And so what I realized was that this type of space that is created in our community has given an opportunity for even a lot of our women and a lot of our families to connect in a way with language. Not only that, but like to open up about some of the experiences they had coming across the border or just living here and working as farm workers. And that to me has been really healing. And when we talk about food justice, when we talk about food sovereignty, I think that we have to recognize that protecting our foodways and protecting our traditional knowledge is part of the way that we are going to heal our planet. And like Lana, I think had said, no, not Lana, Rocio mentioned earlier in her talk, it has to be Indigenous led. It has to be led by our communities of color in this, of this restoration and of this healing, because I think that it can't be outsiders trying to dictate a certain way when the people that actually get most affected are the ones that have been the best stewards of our earth and our land and our soil and our seed, and our traditional knowledge. So, I don't often speak this type of work. To me, I'm not an organized person, even though I organize the community often, but I don't consider myself even an academic in that sense of like what food sovereignty or food justice, all these terms, all this language that we now have. I didn't grow up with that. I grew up with the realities of my parents, being affected by the type of work that they were doing because of their health, through their health. And so where have I fit in? Where has my identity been formed? Where do I feel connected? And it's always has come back to that traditional knowledge, traditional healing in the way that I have brought up my family. And so if we're going to talk about a future where, we start changing and start creating a food system that works for us all, and number one is best for our planet, then we have to come back to these Indigenous leaders and these Indigenous folks, those of us who, are carrying forth these stories and this stewardship of our spaces and the resources that we have. That's really all I wanted to share. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to to come, together with you all. Of these presentations continue to give me more language, continue to grow my own knowledge, and to be present here in my community. In the same way that I'm healing my family and my community, I'm also able to share these stories with you guys. And I appreciate the opportunity. I thank all the organizers and the Green Party for doing that. One of the ways that you can get involved is obviously, connecting to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the continued work that they do. Also if you want to connect with the work that we're doing with community gardens and building capacity in the community, we are a small nonprofit. There's only 3 of us involved in this organization. It's really community led. And so we have an organization website called www.cultivateabundance.org. And that is where you can kind of get involved in the work that we do. And I encourage you to come out to Immokalee to visit. And, I'd love to connect with some of the other panelists and seeing how we can learn from each other, how I can continue to learn from each other, because a lot of the work that you are doing is inspirational and really something that I can help recreate here and continue to do here with our community. So thank you so much. And I'll add my contact information on the chat.
Thank you, Lupita. And I remember when I used to work for Hunger Ration Network, being involved in some of the campaigns in New York City, trying to get the restaurants and the chefs to pay a couple extra cents per tomato to help out the Immokalee workers.
Yes, there's so many stories. I mean, there's so many stories about my own family, and then just the way that back in the 70s, I grew up hearing my parents, it was like 1 penny more, and we come, it's 2021 and we're still struggling with the same thing. And so, I mean, everything from that, at that point in 1993, when the coalition was first starting and I was only 14, and my father had fallen sick. I mean, I remember I even took an ag class that was being offered at the school because I had this idea like, whoa, maybe we could do hydroponics. And of course, I'm 14 years old and I'm listening to my parents and I'm straddling 2 worlds of being like, my indigena, like mestiza self, and then also, this westernized Americana, who needs to be assimilated. But I'm trying to find this middle ground. It always comes back to the land. It always comes back to like what we're growing in our yard, in our land. And I remember going and being so happy to be in this class and being met with, Southern plantation mentality, white man who just didn't care about the class at all. And every question that I asked, he was just like, just put fertilizer on it. It was so degrading. And, because he didn't know the context of my experience of having my father who had been a farm worker his whole life and was at home sick, right, with cancer because of his pesticide exposure and use. And I was there trying to find these, like, grow my own capacity to learn and to like understand ag, right? In my head, I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna change the farming industry. We have to go organic. And we had a friend that my dad would sell tomatoes to because he was a pinhooker, and he would go to this farm in Naples, and the guy's like, "Hey, Candyman," because that's how my dad, everybody referred to him. They said, I can cure you from your cancer. You got to need $30,000 and I will, full organic, plant-based healing. And at the time, I remember my parents scrambling and we're sitting at the table and we're talking like, should we listen to this guy named Frank? Should we not, and really not knowing and not having any resources and not having those tools, not having that language to understand, that, just the injustice of that whole exchange. Right. And so we are still in 2021 continuing to have those struggles. I am involved civically here. I go to meetings to talk about land use and, green spaces, increasing those green spaces. And, when I present myself as a brown, indigena, mestiza, like, and I ask these questions about, how are we being stewards of the land? How are we building capacity in our farm worker community as a county? I'm laughed at, like those I'm deferred to somebody else, or, and just sent down the line. And so a lot of what I've been doing is really just even on social media, like staying involved in the local web pages and just asking questions, getting youth to meet up and talk about the different things that they're experiencing, because I see myself in them. I see myself in them in this community, and all of these things intersect. Everything from our health, I'm currently back in school, pursuing a public health degree. But more and more what I see is we continue to be resilient in Immokalee. We continue to connect in Immokalee through the ways that we are being stewards of the spaces that we have. Sometimes it's 5 buckets in front of a trailer, filled with 14 farm workers, and they have everything from ruda and chaya, and they're growing medicinal plants. These are things that they've brought from their own home countries, and they're still doing it regardless of having just this little bit of space. You see their little collection of water. And so all of these things are things that we need to uplift and highlight and continue to build, build the dignity and the respect that this community deserves. And I hope that I can continue to be a part of that. So thank you for letting me come to this space.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I do want to try to get our last speaker in, who is Chef Shelli McInnis, and she's going to talk about learn how to live by your own means. And if people have questions, put them in the chat.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for having this talk. This is really great. I wanted to add also to my story, I started a Perma-North group. It's called Perma-North Jacks, and that is learning permaculture gardening, or I call it permaculture gardening. One of the 3 principles of permaculture is care of the earth, care of the people, and then return a surplus. And when I was first asked to talk today, I had to look up what food sovereignty was, because like the previous worker said, I didn't grow up with these, previous speaker, I didn't grow up knowing these terms. So there's 7 pillars of food sovereignty. But number 1 focuses on food for people, builds knowledge and skills, works with nature, values food providers, localizes food systems, puts control locally, and that food is sacred. And I was raised in Los Angeles, and in California, it's earthquake country. And so you just have to be prepared. You have to have, your food together, because you never know when it's coming. Now living in Florida, and it's hurricane, right? We're in hurricane season right now. And, so you can kind of prepare, because they tell you a week ahead of time it's coming. And then they tell you 4 days later it's coming, and they'll tell you the exact time it's going to hit your house. So you have to be prepared. So what I try to do is, to preserve the food that we have. And everybody, if you have I've seen people grow amazing things in a small amount of space. So you have to rely on yourself for some things in life. You can't rely that grocery store is always going to be there. I was in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots, and I saw people loot the grocery stores and come up my street with shopping carts. So if I hadn't been prepared, my son and I, we don't know where we would have gotten our food. So what I try to do is tell people, if you're, grow your gardens, grow your food, and then preserve your food so you have it. So in opening our shop, we are going to have a lot of the foods that we preserve, because we will buy in quantity and then we will preserve them. So that way we know what's in it. I mean, as simple as having canned peaches or having canned tomatoes. I don't know anybody who grows tomatoes and only gets 1 tomato. You get too many tomatoes, and your friends all run away every time they see you, because here you come with more tomatoes. Don't you want my tomatoes? Can your tomatoes or dehydrate your tomatoes. And then that way you have tomatoes for another time. It's as simple as buying a bag of dried beans at the store and putting them out in your yard and growing beans. It's just that simple. And if you can't grow beans and you grow tomatoes, your neighbor grows beans, get to know your neighbor and share. Then you take beans and dehydrate them, and then you have your own jar of beans. You can control your own salt intake. You can control all of that. And sorry for the vegans, but you can even can your own chicken. So then that way you can make chicken salad. It's already done, and it's really simple. you know, we just, while I was here, I was cutting up lemons. I do a food rescue, and I have a couple of friends. We go and we rescue food that the stores are going to throw away, and they do a giveaway. And what's really bad is I have one friend who will let people go to her house where her nonprofit is, and they will, you know, pick and choose what they want. And then she's left with cases of produce that nobody wants because they don't know what to do with it. And so I'm big on showing people what to do with it. I presented to a group the other day. We had double chocolate zucchini bread. We had a cheese herb zucchini bread. We had zucchini relish. We had zucchini pickles. I can make zucchini chips, you know, all with one vegetable, you know. And if we get the kids to eating healthier and eating zucchini chips instead of fried potato chips, because these were dehydrated, then we have healthier people. So it's all about preserving and everything like that. What I started the Perma North group off of Permaculture Jacks. And the first time I went to a permaculture meeting, I tell this story all the time. Everyone's sitting around and they're eating from this moringa tree, which I didn't know what moringa tree was. And I told them, I didn't drink the Kool-Aid. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what this is, and I'm not going to eat it. So now I know what it is. I did my own research and I figured out what it is. And so now I had a friend who took mimosa flowers from the mimosa trees that are growing out here in Florida and blackberries and made a cordial. And the mimosa has medicinal properties. And so I told her also gardening and permaculture and stuff is a way to hide our alcohol consumption. So this is a tincture that has very calming properties out of mimosa flowers and blackberries. And so to everybody on the call, I say cheers, and let's do some good work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Technically, we're out of time, so you can all go if you want, but you can stay if people have, you know, some questions and answers. And, you know, Lizzie, along with Mike Gans, you know, organized most of the speakers. So I don't know if she wanted to pose a question, but I had one question. We talked about the upcoming 2021 United Nations Food Summit. I'm going to guess they're not going to talk a lot about these issues or do much on them. And I realize a lot of the work people are talking about is more localized. But does anybody want to have any context to put in? You know, if this was a good UN Food Summit, what would they be talking about? Any of our speakers? Okay, Lizzie, you have a question.
Oh, they don't need to be shy. I am so happy to have this amazing opportunity to hear from these leaders in food. And yes, I know that the UN Food Summit, the pre-summit in Rome in July, and then the summit in New York City, has heard some complaints and is attempting to, you know, include some of these issues and voices. But honestly, our panel should be included. And these issues of food sovereignty, food democracy, and the wisdom of culturally appropriate food and the indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge, it should be in the lead, at the forefront. And the corporations and companies should be way back down there, because these are practices that are in line with nature. And I urge all of you that are on the call to connect with these speakers and their organizations that are doing this work, and learn, spend some time. And it's amazing what I've learned just in this last hour and a half. And don't be afraid to learn about new foods, and to, like Chef Shelli says, to you know, get your hands in there and create it. And my moringa tree did not survive the hurricanes, but I'm going to grow again. So I'm sure some of our panelists would like to answer that question. Mark, what would you like to see in the United Nations Global Food Summit coming up?
I would like to speak to that a little bit. A a lot of people don't realize that most of the foods the world eats and relies on actually are from the Americas, and that the profit made off of all those food systems was directly stolen from indigenous peoples and then misappropriated into gross systems that are actually causing really terrible health and climate crises all around the world. In order to actually reprimand that, we need to center indigenous voices at the heart of these discussions and for further leadership into solutions that we will find to indigenize or reform our food systems. And that in order to truly lead the way, we need to center indigenous peoples at the heart of those discussions.
Well, while other people are thinking about how to answer that question, Lana actually posted a question in chat for Lupita. What would you suggest to an average consumer who wants to help push the food sovereignty movement? And what are some action steps for non-Indigenous folks to contribute and keep it going?
Yes. So when I'm sitting here on this Zoom call and I'm witnessing my family enjoying a traditional meal of pozole using the maize that was harvested. And it's been a 2-day effort, right? And so when I think about the last 2 years of growing this community garden together with Cultivate Abundance and the work that we've been doing here in Immokalee, I think about my own family, and I think about how we have, the more that we have focused on our growing our own food forest and the space that we have and growing those spaces in our community, we are having to rely less and less on this larger food system, right? That is unsustainable. I don't even shop in the produce section anymore because I'm looking at superfoods, right? I'm looking at our ancestral plants like chaya. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. And we're looking at, our own ancestral seed of Guatemalan corn, which comes from some of our local Guatemalan families here. But we are relying more and more on what we can grow, what is resistant, to the changing climate and the extreme climates here. And I think that non-white people can also continue to do more, be led by those type of plants and really build their relationship with plants, plant foods, in a way that is, where they're creating green spaces on their own. So the more food that you're growing, the more you're going to become connected to earth and to the land, and have a consciousness about what is going on around you. I can only see that. And that's whether you're, brown, white, whatever, whatever your background is. Nature is powerful. Mother Earth is powerful. Creator is powerful. And when we try to connect, when we seek that connection, it's going to build us and it's going to guide us. I'll show you real quick a little bit of what I'm seeing here real quick. And let me just stop the filter. And you can see my mom is working on our purple corn. And then Cielo is eating the pozole. And then right out our window, we have our chaya and our mangoes. And I just wanted to share that because that's it's part of what we need to be doing, right? So thank you.
Well, thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to make any final comments or observations?
I'd like to add something. Thank you. In regards to both questions, it's important to recognize that regenerative indigenous agriculture is unique to each place. It's a place-based, culturally based biocultural sovereignty. And so as the UN and any other organizations that reach out to speak to indigenous-led organizations, is to also acknowledge that each each person and each group and a family have a teaching and a specific model for that place in respect to the relationship to where they're from. And so to understand that food systems were uplifted through ecological relational management is incredibly important to support that diversity of food and cultures.
Thank you.
If I can say something. Yes.
Yes.
In the food summit, I am happy to see an increase on importance given to the oceans
Mhm.
and how they provide the fish and the whole, all the products that we get from the ocean. The importance of water, not only of the oceans, but rivers, and how sacred water is for our planet. So I think this is something that is going to be a bigger part of the summit than it has been in past years. And I wanted to thank Lupita for showing us the corn and the family unit and the way you all share the food, the work. Thank you, Lupita. I very much enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. And I'll mention my wife runs a group called Beyond Plastics, and basically trying to end single-use plastics in New York, United States, and the planet. And the fact that for every 3 pounds of fish in the oceans at this point, we got a pound of plastics, and that is just rapidly increasing. Is such a sad thought. There was a question. Any response to the question about vertical farming in urban environments?
I think this is Omowale. I definitely believe in vertical farms, but I also believe that this idea that we're going to talk about vertical farms needs to be secondary to food sovereignty. Like, get land. Don't necessarily, tell the folks, who are low income, who have not been able to have access to land, to go ahead and, focus on being creative. Like, Black folks been being creative, like, for generations. Like, we doing that. Yeah, I know a lot of folks that were doing that, but this space right here was very difficult for us to get, and just because, banks were killer last year. We just moved into this space, and we're making this a space that folks can organize, within. So yeah, we believe might utilize space in terms of vertical farming, whether it be here in Sullivan County or it be in New York City. I believe that folks should be nudged in the direction of being able to, occupy some land, where you are. And when we talk about land, obviously we're going to, end up talking about housing, and when we talk about land, we're talking about, right to that land, right to the, to the water, and the access to food and what we grow. So yes on vertical farming, but also with an asterisk that says land sovereignty, and that needs to be said often enough.
Right. I'll just mention, when I did anti-hunger food policy organizing in New York City, there was a movement to have more and more actual farms, not gardens, but farms on rooftops in New York City, and old factories. And I found it very interesting that they actually look for buildings that were built like before 1940, 1950, not sure the exact date, but basically, 50, 60 years ago, the building codes were 60 pounds per square foot for roofs, and now it's 40 pounds per square foot. And so the older roofs were actually much better because they're able to carry much more large quantities of dirt and soil on their roofs. I found that interesting.
Lupita has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit about in response to the vertical garden question, but also add to what Omowale was saying. There's a lot, here in Immokalee, we have to think that we don't all have the safety to prioritize like ethical food choices, or I mean, in that sense, right? And so we have to get creative, and we also have to be in the work that we're doing as community gardens. Like, it's not all just beautiful. Like, we're creating these spaces, like we're fighting for the keeping of that space, you know, and we're trying to reclaim spaces. So I've had to, you know, on my own time and just as part of the community here, learn how to navigate the county meetings and learn the language that they use when they're talking about, you know, empty lots and you know, what they're going to do with them, and redevelopment plans and what that means for our green spaces, you know, rezoning, and how does that all matter in terms of, you know, like creating spaces or being creative on how to grow your own food. But it's also like we're not the ones taking up space, right? Like, us farm workers and people of color aren't really the ones taking up space. We're being encroached on, you know, still to this day. And so when we think of vertical gardening, we think of, what are we really thinking of? Like, oh, you know, how can we grow more? How can we, but we need to, yes, we need to think about that, right? Those are the creative ways to look at your space, but maybe people don't even have that privilege to even be thinking of like how to design their space. It's more of like, how do I even have a roof over my head or a place to sleep, you know? And so housing and everything has come into play in our food system here when we discuss it as a community. Thank you.
Okay, Lindsay, any closing words? Or Dawn? Dawn's the other co-chair of the EcoAction Committee. We're always looking for volunteers. We have a Facebook page. Meeting fourth Thursday fourth Saturday of each month. Technically, each state Green Party gets to appoint 3 people to the National EcoAction Committee, but we're also trying to, you know, make it possible people just volunteers on our various work committees. We have an education committee. We have a committee working on an eco-socialist Green New Deal. Certainly seems to be a lot of interest around the issues of food sovereignty and food justice. And I imagine we'll try to work with the Global Greens on the upcoming UN Food Summit. But Lizzie, any final words?
Yes, this recording will be on the Green Party US Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And we so appreciate the time and the love that you all have been putting in to sharing your message with all. And we hope to continue to spread this ecological wisdom, and also for us all to take action. So when this Zoom is completed, let's put an action item for ourselves and commit to it. Thank you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.